Buying stuff. It's part of the human experience. If we couldn't buy stuff, what would we even do? Oh, I got it. We could think about stuff to buy. Naturally, we video game loving people love to buy video games. In fact, some of us have even made a conscious effort to not spend money on things that aren't video games as often as we can so that we have more money left over for video games. They can take my home, but they can't take my GameCube. At least not where I'm keeping it. When it comes to buying video games, priority number one for most people is going to be saving as much money as possible. Everyone loves a deal, getting a game for cheap. Heck, some people even buy games they're not excited about just because they're cheap. How do you think copies of Cliffhanger get purchased? Which makes for my first tip. Don't do that. That money spent can really add up over time. And yes, I understand that this is very much advice that falls into the eat your vegetables category. That may not apply to everyone, but it's just food for thought. Sometimes the best ways to buy games are to avoid the ways that aren't. And if the ultimate goal is to save money, this could be a way to save a ton of it. Buying cheap games you don't really care about is an easy trap to fall into. The dopamine rush of adding a game to your collection for only $10, $5, $1, who knows? But I'd argue that in certain cases, what you're really purchasing is the feeling of getting a new game, not the actual game itself. In a similar vein, I've always had a theory this is part of why pickup videos are so popular. You get to sort of experience the rush of getting games without having to do anything or even spend your own money. And listen, I don't judge, I straight up pretend to have and do things I don't. Here's my copy of Little Samson, and here's my Ferrari, and here's me cleaning my bathroom. To be clear, I'm not saying that every game people purchase for cheap is a game they're not excited about. I'm simply saying that it does happen sometimes. I just think it can be helpful to take a step back and evaluate what you're doing. If there are cheap games in your collection that do nothing for you past the initial dopamine rush when you buy them, then maybe consider not buying games like that. Is that fair? What I suggest is to save your money to get the games you really want. Less games, but better games, and the games you don't buy are savings towards the games you do. Remember now, they call me Mr. Consolidation, something I'm proud to add to the list. But you know, some of those games that seem like they're too expensive that you've always wanted, you might have been able to afford some of them by now had you held off on a bunch of the games you weren't as excited for, while instead putting that money aside. Sometimes I celebrate the games I don't buy as a victory. And I know what some of you are thinking by now. I don't need some sort of motivational hoorah speech from a life coach, buddy. What are you, my dad? Speaking of dads, hey dad, aren't you proud of me for talking about financial responsibility? I mean, where'd y'all think I learned nanners are a financially friendly fruit? But yeah, some of you are thinking, just tell me the best way to buy games, assuming I'm buying games that I definitely want. I hear ya. I just needed to share potentially very effective advice first that nobody else ever seems to mention. But with that, my next tip that I like to repeatedly stress is to consider importing Japanese games, which right away some people think importing, that sounds really complicated. But nope, all it is buying the Japanese versions of games for less money instead of the American versions for more money. Most Japanese versions of games are cheaper than the US versions and sometimes significantly cheaper. Doesn't really make sense to me to consider Japanese versions any less cool either, since a lot of older games were made in Japan, so in a way they could be seen as closer to the source. And most of them can be easily played on American systems too, since they use the same TV standard, NTSC. Yep, that's what that's referring to on your games, National Television Standards Committee. Before I knew this, I had a different guess. Japanese cartridge-based games tend to be especially easy to play on American systems, often with solutions as simple as cheap cartridge adapters, removing plastic tabs on the cartridge slot, or heck, for the N64, you can just buy cheap 3D printed universal cartridge slots. For the entire Game Boy family, there are no tricks required. You literally don't need to do anything. Well, yeah, you gotta pop the games in, but then you're good to go. When it comes to CD-based consoles, it's not always as straightforward, but often still not too bad. For the Sega Saturn, people will often just get these action replay carts that can plug right in, allowing you to play games from any region, as well as backup game saves and expand the system's RAM for games like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, a game you'll probably want. Most other disc-based consoles require modification unless you want to mess around with disc swapping maneuvers, and the PS1 is a good example of this, but it might be worth it to have your PS1 modified, and especially if you're not the one who has to do it. Just buy a PS1 that's already region modified. Better yet, buy a region modified PS2, which is of course backwards compatible with PS1, to really have access to a motherload of games. For what it costs, you'll likely more than save the money back on the Japanese games you buy. For example, I often see people hooting and hollering about how much Klonoa costs hundreds of dollars. I bought the Japanese version for $15. Naturally, people will be concerned about the language barrier for playing certain games, and sadly, most of the expensive RPGs are a no-go if you were hoping for English text. But happily, there are lots of games where you can get by. Ain't that nice? Getting by without reading much at all, like what I did in school. Plus, there's lots of games where the menus are in English anyways. Moving on, for my next tip, I want to talk about buying games online, a popular choice. To me, the golden rule when it comes to buying games online is to only buy things where you can see pictures of it to evaluate the condition. Unless something is really cheap and you're taking a calculated risk, I'm not sure why you wouldn't. If somebody is selling you something and can't even snap a few pictures on their phone, then I don't think they deserve your business. Unless it's a place with a good reputation, then maybe, but typically the places that don't show you pictures are the places that don't have good reputations. And that's no coincidence. Like using scissors with your eyes closed. It could work out, right? Don't do it. Buying items sight unseen is an unnecessary risk asking for trouble, and won't take long for you to get burned if you keep doing it. For as much as people trash eBay, you can at least see pictures of what you're buying, and most sellers will even send you additional pictures with close-ups or better lighting if you ask them. So ask them kindly, and you'd be surprised how nice people can be. I've even chatted people up about how their day is going, their morning, their breakfast. What can I say? I'm a sucker for a good banana story. eBay and other sites like it will also typically show you a seller's feedback. There's plenty of sellers out there that you can choose to only buy from the ones with basically perfect feedback. As tips for getting the lowest prices, I suggest keeping an eye on newly listed items. The ones that have been sitting around available for a long time have likely been sitting around available for a long time for a reason. Like me in high school, who wants to date? Nobody, and my wife thanks you all. You can find a million listings for Sonic the Hedgehog 2 in bad condition at any given time. I'd suggest to wait for a fresh new listing to pop up for a similar price, but hopefully in much better condition. As for auctions, from my personal experience, I found that the auctions that start at higher opening bids will, ironically, tend to sell for less overall. My theory is because starting an auction at 99 cents just attracts way more attention, whereas the higher starting bids scare people off. Of course, if a starting bid is higher than the total you want to end up paying, then that's obviously a no-go. Okay, but what if you really want to get low prices? Well, it never hurts to put the word out to friends and family that you are the video game person. That's the reputation you want to have. Much better than some of the other familial reputations a person can have. But if you're the video game person, you'll be thought of if anybody is looking to offload some gaming stuff, and you'll likely get it for cheap or possibly even free. Then, of course, there is the garage sale, flea market, thrift store / anywhere people are trying to get rid of stuff for cheap route. The big thing I always tell people when it comes to this is that you need to consider the time spent doing it, unless your time isn't worth anything to you, or if just looking, ideally with friends, is fun for you, even if you don't find anything. I think that's the best way to do it, because then you can't lose. Either way, you'll need to determine how much time you're comfortable investing relative to the amount of success you'll have. If you happen to also be a fan of elderly people's old dishes and clothes, then this will almost definitely pay off for you. Or what about bags of cords you'll never use, but just in case? Hey, we've all got those. We must be fans. Personally, I've never been a huge fan of getting games this way, mostly because even if by some miracle I find what I'm looking for, it probably won't be in the condition I want. Sorry, Jeremy, I'm only interested in things autographed by Timmy. Now, while shopping at places like flea markets are all about trying to buy from people who don't know what stuff is worth, on the flip side you have local game shops, where the staff is usually pretty knowledgeable. Local game shops can definitely be hit or miss depending on the people who work there, if you even have one nearby at all. I'm lucky to have one nearby where the entire staff is awesome, and they even do console mods for very reasonable prices. Remember those region-free mods I mentioned earlier? I think local game shops are a good opportunity to think about where your money is going. Would you rather your money go to a group of people who are passionate about games and trying to make retro gaming a part of your local community, or a giant company's bottom line? It's something that's easy to forget. We get so focused on the amount that we're spending that we don't even care who we're giving it to. Well, I'd argue that one of the best ways to buy games is to give your money to someone you feel deserves it. I think most people can get behind a sentiment like that. Alright, and for one final little tidbit of advice, be sure to keep re-releases in mind, like Rare Replay here, which has all the best Rareware games, except for the best ones. Speaking of which, yes, I did hear about the Rocket Knight pack that was announced. Which leads to my next point, that if a game is really expensive, you might be able to just wait it out for a re-release, as it seems like more and more stuff is getting re-released as time goes on. Until then, this is my copy of Little Samson. Okay, and before I wrap it up, I'd like to address the folks who will say something along the lines of, the best way to buy games, how about by not? Just use emulators or EverDrive carts and play for free. And yes, those are indeed options as well if you don't want to buy individual hard copies of games. But I think the point of this video was to address the folks who are, so there you have it. And yes, this video didn't really talk about digital purchases either because the focus was hard copies. But let me know what you thought of my advice, as well as any tips you might have yourselves. For that and anything else you might like to say, leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the Retro Bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the Retro Bird, oh yes, and he hopes that you liked what he had to say.